Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Cam Webster, and welcome to The Art of Boring, the podcast where we dive deeper into Moore's investment philosophy and thinking in order to help you, our listeners, become more informed investors. Ultimately, we hope to connect you with the people at Moore who find excitement in delivering on Be Boring, Make Money.
I'm Rob Campbell, filling in for Cam this week. And on today's episode, equity analyst John Wilson joins me to talk about the competitive advantages of a decentralized structure. We get into companies where we've seen this work and the keys to making it a success.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Any views expressed in this podcast are based upon the information available at the time and are subject to change.
Well, John, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks
for being here. Maybe just before we dive into the topic today, a little bit more on your background. So you joined Moore in 2012, was it?
That's right. Yeah, 2012.
And so maybe just a reminder for folks who are listening, how does it work when you join Moore as an analyst? And more specifically, how did you wind up on the global small cap team?
Yeah, sure. So the way it works at Moore is we have this rotation program. So when you join, you'll actually rotate through all the different portfolios. So we have a common investment philosophy, obviously, wealth creating companies run by capable and honest management teams purchased at a discount to intrinsic value. But you find that depending on the geography that you're in, the way you actually go about executing on that's very different. So rotating through is very helpful as it allows you to see how the philosophy is applied in different manners.
So I would think it's not just the different geographies or asset classes, but it's also probably the people. So there's this common philosophy, but every individual on the team might have some nuances in terms of their approach. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that you find, different asset classes have different opportunity sets. So if I look at global small cap, our investable universe is over 20,000 companies. And I was actually talking about this with Kern the other day, the other analyst on the fund, and his comment was we were just talking about how we have these opportunities to find these companies that it's almost like a treasure hunt where you're walking along the beach and then you find some gold and it's actually really exciting. Our bodies have a similar almost reaction to finding treasure. Like my heart starts beating quicker. My hands are sweaty. It's an amazing feeling. So that's one of the aspects on why I wanted to go to global small cap is that just given the size of the universe, you're going to find new companies that you haven't seen before, whether they're recently listed or whether they're just in areas that you haven't looked before. So it's always new. So that's one of the things that I found that drew me to the global small cap.
I would imagine as well, tell me if this is true or not, but I would think that it's also a function of where the team needs some help too.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I talked about it from my preference standpoint, but there's also a matching up on the other side. Where are the gaps in the team? Where do we need to add resources to? So absolutely, there's that component as well.
Great. Well, thanks. That's good background. Thank you. Okay, so maybe let's dive into what we're here to talk about today, which is this concept of decentralized structures. And before we get into what makes it work, where you've seen it applied and how you think about it, can you tell us what that actually means, just from a definition standpoint? What is a decentralized structure?
So the way I define a decentralized structure is pushing decision-making down to lower levels in the organization. And you can really see that it manifests itself in two different types of decision-making. The ones around operations. So how can you run the plant better? That's probably the most common one I see. There's also ones around just how to create a better product for customers. So if you're closer to the customers, you understand it better. And even it can go as far as customer service. So an example with some of these luxury hotel chains, you find that the people that actually deal with the customers have a lot of autonomy in serving them. So for example, let's say you go to a luxury hotel and you get there and the room's not clean or it's not ready. If the customer service rep had to go and get approval from headquarters every time there was an issue like that, they'd have really poor customer service. So that's another example of where decision-making is pushed down from an operational standpoint. The other angle that you see it in is what we call capital allocation. So in our philosophy, we invest in wealth-creating companies. So that often means that there's excess cash flow that those businesses throw off. And the decision on where to put that cash flow, whether to reinvest in the business or to do M&A, those decisions are also pushed down to the lower levels in the organization. And maybe the one caveat I would say about this is that it's a spectrum. It's not black or white. You can't say this company is decentralized and this company is centralized, but rather they exist along a spectrum. And even within the same company, there's different activities that a company does. So you think about a brewer, they would not only be involved in, it's not just brewing, but they actually have marketing, they actually have distribution. So the level of decentralization might actually vary depending on the activity. So they might have a very decentralized marketing Marketing might be done at the national level or at the local level, but production is done centrally. So that even within the business, it can differ on how much it's decentralized or centralized.
Okay, so I'm trying to think of analogies for this. So the first one I think of is like an army. So I have this old school notion of these armies in the 17 and 1800s where there'd be a general who's really making all decisions for his troops. And if something happens, well, that's got to work its way all the way back up to the general to make a decision and then flow all the way back down to the troops. My understanding, at least with the current setup within the U.S. Army, for example, is they are trying to decentralize, give a little more autonomy to those pods who are out there in the field to be able to be flexible and make decisions in that regard. But I think what you're saying is, there are some decisions that ultimately do probably have to go all the way back up. It's a spectrum. It can't be, they're not just these two endpoints. There are lots of levels of gray in between.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way of thinking?
Yeah, that's a great way, great analogy. Yeah.
Okay. I was also thinking about, like football or high school football. Pretty much every play is dictated by the coach. What happens on the field, obviously there's some discretion there, but play by play, it's the coach. It's a very centralized structure as to what's going to actually happen or how the play is going to take place. I played a lot of rugby where, sure, there was a coach, but decision-making was really made by people on the field. And I think it was the nature of the sport that dictated why a certain structure worked better than others. Is that also true of the companies that you're looking at? Are there specific types of companies that maybe lend themselves better or worse to having a decentralized structure?
A particular business model, I would say that it, again, depends on the activity. So a business model is obviously a collection of activities. It's not just one thing. And a decentralized model tends to really work well from a decision-making standpoint. Where it works less well is when there is some benefit to economies of scale. So if you think about operations that have manufacturing, distribution, procurement, oftentimes those things are better to centralize because, yeah, sure, there might be an advantage from a decision-making standpoint, but the advantage that you get on the economies of scale is just so great that it doesn't make sense to do that. So generally speaking, it would probably be fair to say decentralize decision-making, centralize things that have economies of scale.
Okay. And so where there's a need for, and I think this is related to the economies of scale, it's like where there's a need for this massive amount of coordination between different groups for the process to work. I'm thinking about like a car manufacturing plant. Clearly, there's got to be this overarching structure to enable everything to work. So a need for a more centralized. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, it can be around coordination. Absolutely. The other one is just, I think about one of the companies we own, Bravita, which provides electrical and HVAC installation and maintenance services. So they run a portion of their business in a very decentralized manner. At the branch level, the manager's compensated on the local branch level profitability, but they centralize the procurement. So all the equipment that they purchase is purchased at headquarters because they find they get a cost advantage in actually centralizing that component. So it goes into that comment around just the advantage that you can get around economies of scale in some of these activities.
Okay. So I want to dig into that a little bit more, but just before we get there, and maybe we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to make sure that we cover it in full. As you think about a company's life cycle, are there other things beyond operational or capital allocation decisions that a decentralized structure might help? And I guess what I'm thinking about is the companies is small. There's a lot of autonomy within that small group. As they grow, do you necessarily lose some of that autonomy or do you have to? And what does a decentralized structure try to solve there?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that the decentralized organization can help with. So Daniel Pink has this great book called Drive, and the whole book is about what creates intrinsic motivation in employees. And one of the things that he found is it's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So very simple acronym AMP, what gets you amped up. That's one of the things he talks about. So if you think about a decentralized structure, I think it helps with all of those. So if you think about autonomy, so that's basically being left alone to do what you think is best for the organization, not being micromanaged. That can actually work very well, not only from a motivation standpoint, from the employee standpoint, but also from the business standpoint. So one of the businesses that we own is AdTech. It's a company that produces industrial components. They're very small cost, but they're very important to the end customer. So customers tend to not be that price sensitive.
What type of components?
So it would be valves would be a big thing for them. It's a conglomerate, so it's across a number of different industries. But one of the advantages that they have in their model is just they tell potential acquisitions, hey, we're not going to come in and change how you operate. You know your customer better. We're going to introduce some oversight. We're going to introduce some frameworks and provide education if you want to take your business to the next level, but we're not going to come in and wholesale change things. So oftentimes you're the acquirer of choice for businesses that are looking to maybe take some cash off the table, but still be involved in operations. So from an autonomy standpoint, decentralized organization helps. From a mastery standpoint, which is the ability to get very, very good at something, a decentralized organization is really great for that, because you've taken the actual decision-making process and you've empowered your employees to make those decisions, so they actually get trained up in how to operate the business. So one of the businesses that we own is Constellation Software, and what they've been talking about for years is the main bottleneck for their growth, the main thing that's holding them back, is talented individuals that can allocate capital and that can run the business. So when you think about that, their strategy of running a decentralized organization actually makes a lot of sense, because they're training tomorrow's leaders.
I would think that there's a flip side to that too, though, right? I mean, if you're giving lots of autonomy and you're decentralizing that structure, I would imagine that that also poses a problem in some degrees to succession, because there isn't this clear plan, or that, somebody that you can go back up to. Is it true that sometimes if a business unit, to use a Constellation Software term, has little connection to the rest of the organization, what happens when the key man or the key individual there moves on? Does that not pose a risk?
I think it would actually remove key person risk, because again, you're pushing down the decision making, so it doesn't all run through that one person in the organization at headquarters, but instead you have a collection of trained up decision makers. So I think it can actually help with that, alleviate those problems.
Okay, so we talked about autonomy, just to go back to Daniel Pink. So the autonomy on decision rights, I can say as an employee, I like not being micromanaged. It's empowering. There's the mastery element. So you're a little bit more in control of your destiny to build skill sets that you otherwise wouldn't. I don't know that we covered the purpose piece in as much detail as I would have liked. Can you say a little bit more just about that?
Sure. So purpose is really just the feeling that the work means something to you. And the goal, if you think about a decentralized business, you want people to feel as though they're in charge of almost an entrepreneurial enterprise. So they have a business within a larger business that they take ownership in. And if you ever talk to an entrepreneur, they often refer to their companies as their baby. They have a lot of invested in it. They want to see it succeed. And that's what you're trying to create with a decentralized structure. It's something that we use in Global Small Cap as well. We call it entrepreneurs within the enterprise. And because all great ideas need to have an acronym, we call it EWE. And the idea is that...
EWE?
EWE,
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So EWE is you want to set up the structure, which I think we'll be talking about it in a bit, so that you can run as though you're an entrepreneur and have a lot of autonomy. It allows you to improve your skills and hopefully create purpose for you as well.
And inherent in all of this, I would imagine, though, is you have to have the right people on the bus.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you've got to have people who are naturally inclined or just wired to want to operate autonomously, who are just driven to constantly make improvements and to help out. Am I right that a decentralized structure wouldn't work if you've got a bunch of people who are just sort of coasting and are looking for direction?
Absolutely. If you have an organization where employees aren't interested in being proactive, then you're not going to get the behavior that you want.
And then maybe just to finish up on what's the problem it's trying to solve, can you talk a little bit about how this helps a business scale? And maybe Mark Leonard is a good example there. You think about the Constellation Software business model. It's getting these acquisitions at really attractive rates of return. You become a bigger company. How can one person, or how can Mark Leonard do all the acquisitions? Surely there reaches a point where his time is just not divisible that way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. Oftentimes, as you scale up, if you think about information flowing through the organization, the larger the organization grows, the more difficult it is for one decision maker to handle all those decisions and to allocate capital across the firm or to make operational decisions. So it's very helpful to have this decentralized structure.
So I'm running a business. I'm trying to scale my business. I see the advantages of having a decentralized structure that I'd like to implement. What are the keys to making this work? In other words, what do I need, or where have you seen in the global small cap universe this really done successfully? And can you draw some key lessons out of that in terms of what really makes this type of structure work?
Sure. So there's a couple mental models or thoughts around this. The first one would be what I would deem, or what I would call, clarity and alignment. It's one of the things that we talk about internally, and one of the things we look for when we're talking to management that have a decentralized structure is field marking. So
sorry, field marking?
Field marking,
okay.
Yeah. And so that there's three categories within that. It's where are we going? So what's the goal, and how do we measure progress towards that goal? What's your role in getting closer to that goal? And what does that involve? What activities does that involve, and what activities does that not involve?
Okay, so maybe just to make sure I get this. So I'm setting up a decentralized structure, and we're speaking in black and white terms. I'm sure this happens, more organically, but companies would decide to do this. And so what you're saying is, in those conversations, as they seek to push out the decision making below them, these are conversations that would have to happen with those managers who are going off to run the underlying units.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So when I'm talking about field marking, these are the decisions that should be made centrally.
Okay.
So this is the kind of the big decisions, the big direction, and the other component along with direction in the actual role is just what I classify as values. So areas that we've all agreed upon, this is how we're going to act. So for example, one of the things at Mower we believe in, and one of the things we talk a lot about is candidness. So that's not just telling the truth, but it's if you disagree, you need to speak up, because we think that helps make better decisions. So from a value standpoint, that's something that we've all agreed upon.
And values and culture are pretty much synonymous in a lot of ways in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Your corporate values are going to dictate the culture that you have.
Exactly. Values are kind of the rules of engagement that you've decided upon. And the reason why we call it field marketing is because the idea is you kind of say, hey, this is what the goal is. Here's your role on the team. And then here are the boundaries. And that's kind of the value piece. Now, within those boundaries, go ahead, be an entrepreneur. So that's why we call it field marketing.
Okay. So for an organization to do this successfully, they have to have really clear parameters around what the autonomous decision-making can operate within.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Absolutely.
So field marketing is one of them. What else is key to making this work?
And the other key thing is aligned incentives. So you want to make sure that the incentives are aligned within the organization. So ideally, when you think about aligned incentives, you want something that they can control and something that gets you closer to the goal that's aligned. So we've seen good incentive structures around return on capital, net promoter score, which is a measure of customer satisfaction, on-time deliveries, things like that.
So I want to go back to the Bravita example. So their branches operate autonomously. Those branch managers have leeway in terms of making decisions as to what they should do, but ultimately the alignment is in the way that they're compensated, which is tied to a more centralized agreement at, return on capital or profitability, whatever it is.
Yeah. And in that case, what they tie it to is factors the manager can control. So in that case, they have control of their costs. So they're compensated on a margin, and working capital is the other component. So they're compensated on lowering their working capital.
Okay. So alignment, talked about a lot of things when it comes to alignment, but that's really the first key to making it work. What's the next one?
The other important thing that you have in place is a system for having oversight over the decentralized organization.
Okay. And is that different than alignment?
Yes, I would say it's different. Alignment is we all agree that this is the right direction to head. And hey, you're going to be compensated for heading in this direction. This is a control. This is, hey, are you actually heading in that direction? Or hey, is there issues that crop up? And I think the other thing is you can actually, there's these really interesting cases where you use social pressure. So I've seen it before. I've talked to a manager, the way he runs his business, he will, whenever there's meetings of all the subsidiary managers, on their name tag, they'll have their name tag, and then I think it's return on capital that they have or customer satisfaction that they have. So it just creates this little incentive to focus on, again, go back to that goal that you're...
So you're walking around with a report card on.
Exactly. and we do that here at Mower as well. You'll notice we're doing this in the library here. On the wall over there, there's a list of, we call it the bathroom list. So this is every year we need to go and review all the companies in our portfolio. And there's stats on that.
So these minimum standards for things that you
Absolutely.
Need to do at a minimum annually to be able to keep holding a stock in the portfolio.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it's on a 12-month lap. And you'll look, and most of the stats are above 90%. We've talked to management in the last 12 months. We've updated the model. They're probably higher than that. But still, because you see that, let's say Canadian large caps at 98% and global small caps at 95%, it gives you that little extra nudge.
Okay. So nobody wants to be the one who's sort of last or not on board.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's get back to the oversight piece. It's ultimately the concept of a dashboard.
Yes. Often these companies, so I think about Freightways, which is a company based out of New Zealand that does courier services. They are able to look at branch profitability all the way down to the local level, and they can compare that to how that branch performed the year before. And so they can flag if there's there's anomalies, things that are outside of the historic range, to try to understand what's happening and whether they need to step in and coach and provide advice to the local manager.
Okay, so we've got alignment of incentives, which is sort of setting the playing field. You've got effective oversight systems, which is the monitoring aspect, but I would also think is sort of the accountability piece too, or ensuring accountability. And so you mentioned three things. What's the final one?
The final one's aggregating up information. So one of the potential disadvantages of a decentralized organization is that people might learn the same lesson again and again and again. So you might make an error at one plant, and that might be replicated at another plant,
or don't realize that you're making a mistake,
or don't realize
learning happens at some other plant, and it just doesn't filter through the rest of the
from a best practice standpoint. Absolutely. So the idea is you should aggregate up learnings, whether it's a mistake or whether it's best practices, so that people can learn from each other.
Is there an example of a company that you've looked at that does that really effectively?
So going back, ad tech is a business that does that quite well. So the company has what they call the Ad Tech Business School. So throughout the year, they hold seminars where the various subsidiaries meet up, and they share best practices from what they learned in their businesses. And the management team itself educates them around concepts around managing your working capital, allocating capital, serving the customer, R&D, things like that. And so the managers are able to benefit from these education seminars in order to take their business to the next level.
What are some of the areas where there are pitfalls associated with this? Where can companies get this wrong?
Well, I think one of the big things is when you don't have these structures in place and when you're not deliberate about setting up the right incentives. So one of the things that Charlie Munger said, who's Buffett's right-hand man, is you show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So that is something that's important to set up.
I mean, we've talked a lot about the companies that you're looking at, but what about us? Are we a decentralized organization?
Yeah, I think here at Moore, we absolutely are. So when I think about that framework that we talked about just around clarity, so this weekend we're going off on our annual retreat. So that's where we clarify where we're headed, the end goal. We also talk about roles and recommit to the values of the firm. I think we also have a very clear investment philosophy. So we're very clear that we're looking for companies that are wealth creating, run by capable and honest management teams, and purchase at a discount to intrinsic value. That's something that we talk a lot about it. And I think there's a high degree of clarity around that. And then if you think about the second component, which is around effective oversight, there's a number of different mechanisms that are in place around that. So we talked a bit about the bathroom list, just trying to be up to date on that. And then I think the other thing is we have these 60-day check-ins where every employee within research will check in with a leadership member, and they will check in on things like what's holding them back in their current role. Are there any bottlenecks that they're encountering? It can be a check-in on whether they're encountering any issues or what's going well. And then that ties in a bit to the aggregating of information, because there's also these conversations around best practices that happen then too. Finally, if you think about the aggregation of knowledge, we have this great tool that we use internally called M42. So this is a great database of all the notes on companies that we've spoken with, our thoughts on those companies. And that's a great way to see what other people think about a business, what they think about the quality of a management team, and that stokes further conversations.
And what about the global small cap team? I mean, so you guys operate as an asset class team independently, but in terms of the four of you, would you say that you guys within that group operate in a decentralized way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that was a big push, a big thing that we've been working on for a number of years now. Almost out of necessity, in the last year, we had one of our members, Curran, move to Singapore. So obviously that makes it very hard to run the portfolio or the team in a very centralized manner, because the time zones are completely off. I think it's 12 hours from Toronto, 10 from here. So it becomes very difficult. So when you think about setting the kind of field marking, so you have a really good understanding of where you should spend your time and what sort of activities you should be involved in, those things become very important, and oversight also becomes important. So that whole framework applies right through global small cap, and we found that it's increased our efficiency a lot.
Okay, great. Bunch of amped up individuals on the global small cap team. And again, thanks so much for having on the podcast. Love to have you back.
Thanks, Rob.
Hey everyone, Cam here again. To subscribe to the Art of Boring podcast, go to more, that's mawer.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review on iTunes, which will help more people discover the Be Boring, Make Money philosophy. Again, thanks for listening.